I thought about starting earlier tonight, maybe at 6 or something, ended up having a baseball coaches meeting, so didn't work out, but that's okay. We'll get through this. We got roughly an hour to get through 5 chapters, so plenty of time there. Hopefully, we'll see. But yeah, I will say, obviously you guys know, a lot of you guys have been around church and even probably in some ministry for a while, but you guys know what the week leading up to Easter is like. So a lot of my study for this week happened last week. And so if I skip over anything, or if I mix stories or anything like that, just call me out on it. Because I have refreshed, but all my deep diving was last week, so. But we will, let's see. Does anyone remember what kind of ended the last section we ran? Where did we close last time? 2 weeks ago. What was happening?
Absalom was kind of seemingly taking over. He's like heading, it's like 2 parties, right? He's heading to Jerusalem, kind of coming in basically as king, kind of. And then David is like on the outs, but his friend, Hushai or whatever, was like, well, I'll go be the mole.
Yeah.
And so they, like to see the curtain closes as they both arrive at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, so we talked last time about Absalom's rebellion, right? So David, kind of in light of, or in consequence of his sin with Bathsheba, one of those consequences was that remember how it said the sword would never leave his house? We kind of see that play out in real time as Absalom makes a play for the throne and tries to overthrow David. And maybe kind of surprisingly, we talked a little bit about this as we closed. David doesn't have any interest in having a war or fighting battles in Jerusalem. He flees Jerusalem for the safety of the people, for the righteousness of the city. He leaves there. Absalom has no shortage of support. He has won the hearts of many, many men. David still has an army unto himself, but Absalom's is equal, if not larger, given the success he's had in recruiting the other tribes. So he has rallied his troops. As Eric said, Hushai was a friend of David's who said, I'll kind of go back, and mole was probably a perfect way to kind of put it. I'll be your enemy behind the gates, so to speak. I'll be your spy behind the gates. And so that's kind of where we pick up kind of towards that area, kind of following those events. And yeah, I thought some of I have this note in here that says, given how we left last week, and when we're kind of looking at the results of undealt with justice or injustice, that landed on a good Sunday for Eric's message, but I think that was not this past Sunday, but 2 weeks ago is probably when I made that note, and kind of just talking about God as judge, and how we do one day God who judges sin. And so we get to this passage. I think a lot of your places is going to pick up with something. We see kind of David interact with a handful of people here in chapter 16 that will actually, because of the way the class has fallen now, we don't have to wait. You would have been introduced to these people last week. We would have talked about them and then revisited them this week, and now we kind of all get to deal with it together. But you meet some people who we're going to meet again and interact with here in later chapters. It says, when David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of donkeys saddled, bearing 200 loaves of bread, hundreds of bunches of raisins, and 100 of summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And so we have to kind of caution, I guess, how much we read tonight. We'll have to do some paraphrasing. But David and Ziba have this interaction. And who is Ziba? Ziba is a servant of
Mephibosheth.
Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth is who?
Saul's crippled son.
Yeah. And so
grandson.
Grandson. But also what we refer to as son a lot too, the son of Saul. Just noting that he's from the house of Saul. And it's somebody that David wanted to pay mercy towards in honor of his covenant with Jonathan. But Ziba comes, and Ziba makes a case that Mephibosheth has changed his mind, or kind of turned heel, so to speak. That's probably not appropriate to talk about someone lame in their feet, but he has turned, it looks like, at least according to Ziba, don't want to give any spoilers, but it looks like to Ziba that Mephibosheth is now kind of under the impression that maybe he's going to be Team Absalom, and Absalom's going to come and restore everything he already had before. Now, we saw a few weeks ago, David made a very generous and gracious deal with Mephibosheth and sat him at his table, and so this is kind of surprising, but David doesn't spend a lot of time there, right? He just kind of says, okay, what I have given over to Mephibosheth will be yours. And so David, Ziba says Mephibosheth went into, or is kind of following after Absalom's kingdom now. And the narrator kind of repeats the names over and over, as we've seen in the story. One of the things we pick up on is the repetition of names to show who's driving the car here. And so one of the names, if you're highlighting names, you'll see in these first 4 verses, let me see, at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I miss a lot, but I have at least 6 times they want to point out these 4 verses. It's Ziba that is driving the car, and that should kind of perk our ears up the way we've seen. We had that a lot with, we've seen that a lot with Joab. We've seen it with David, even at times with the Lord, where that repetition comes in. It's one of the observation or comprehension questions we ask are like, what words are repeated? Well, there's names who are repeated. And so Ziba's driving the car here. What's going on here, the narrator wants us to know is of Ziba's doing. And so Ziba receives, it says, today the house of Israel will give me back, or excuse me, that's what Mephibosheth said. And the king said to Ziba, behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. So whatever, now Ziba has taken that gracious offer that was once given to Mephibosheth. And sometimes we want to pay attention to what's in the text, but what is maybe surprisingly left out in this interaction on David's part?
Questions about.
Maybe we should examine this. Does this sound like Mephibosheth? Can we get a witness? Can we get a second opinion? Can we investigate this further? David just kind of acts quickly. Now, granted, a lot going on. It's got a lot going on. And so, but as we want to point out some things about, not here and there, we'll land the plane and kind of talk through what we should take away from these chapters, but we have these nuggets along the way. We're talking about leadership or even just kind of our own service, our own relationships. We don't want to jump to certain conclusions, especially when this would be frowned upon from the character of Mephibosheth, or it would be against him, so to speak. This brings out negative. So we want to be aware of one-sided stories, especially if you're a person of authority like David is here. So then, so that we kind of move quickly past that. Again, that's only 4 verses, and then we get into the story of, I'm going to pronounce it Shimei. I'll probably iterate, but you know what I'm talking about, right? And Shimei comes, and what's his problem?
Same clan as Saul.
Yeah. So you've got Shimei here, and he's upset with David, right? He's hurling 2 things. What's he hurling?
Stones.
He's hurling stones and insults, basically, or curses. So he's very upset, and he is cursing David. Why is he cursing David continually, as it says in verse 5?
Claims he's a murderer.
Yeah, he says, you're a man of blood. He calls him in verse 7, I want to point this out for later. He says, get out, you man of blood. You are a worthless man. You're a man of lawlessness. You're a man of no moral value. So, begs the question. One we'll kind of get into here, or will be examined further on a little bit by David and one of his servants. But is there truth in this? Is David a man of blood? Yeah, I mean, David had Uriah murdered, but I think, as Joey kind of pointed out here, this man's issue is with David's interaction with the house of Saul. Is David guilty of being an avenger of blood or the slayer of Saul? No, he refused that. By no means is he a man of blood in the way that this guy accuses him of in relation to the house of Saul. But yeah, he is responsible for the death of Uriah, and therefore this man says, well, this is a vengeance. This is vengeance upon the blood of the house of Saul. And now the Lord is going to give the hand into your son Absalom. Now your evil is on you, and you are a man of blood. And Abishai, who's this, he's part of this trio of brothers who you don't really have to go. They don't have to go looking for trouble. It just kind of finds them, and they are all about justice in many ways. And so he doesn't like this. He wants to take the guy's head off immediately. And David says no, right? And it's not that his response is necessarily overly wrong. Like, no one should be able to say that to a reigning king. In Abishai's mind, and I can understand that. And most kings wouldn't stand to let themselves be cursed. But David rejects his offer of his willingness to happily take this guy's head off. He says no. This king actually allows a man, surprisingly, he allows this man who's cursing him, throwing stones at him, to keep his head. And it gives us a little insight into the character of David, where he's at right now. See him kind of in this position of humility. Maybe he's maturing a little bit. And he asks a question that a lot of us don't probably think to ask as much as we should. In verse 12, David's response. What is David's response to this cursing?
Kind of like, let him do it. It might be from the Lord.
Might be. And so instead of just reacting and going into immediate defense mode, he says, hey, what might God be doing in this and through this? That's always a fun question to ask in the moment of crisis or in the moment of conflict, but he's showing a little bit of maturity. What is God doing in this? He's aware that this possibly could be, it may come to be something that God actually has a hand in, or if it's not true, and this curse is not something that's of God, then it'll matter about as much as the rocks and dust that this guy's hurling in the end. And so David is trusting in the goodness and ultimately the sovereignty of God. And he makes the expression, it may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. David is trusting in one of the themes that we've seen all throughout Scripture, in that God can bring good from the curse. And so David says, in the end, maybe I will be justified for this. Maybe I'll receive mercy. He's hoping in the sovereignty. He's trusting in the sovereignty of God and hopes in his mercy. So let this man do whatever he would. In the end, it'll be God who has the final say. And so he trusted in God's sovereignty. He's hoping in his mercy. And so David lets them they just kind of move on while that guy continues to throw stones and fling dust. And they arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself. And then we get to verses 15 through the end of the chapter. And this is Absalom's entry. It's interesting. On a week where we have just come off of Palm Sunday, talking about a triumphant, holy entry, we have a very unholy entry here in verses 15 to the end of chapter 16, right? Absalom makes his way into Jerusalem. And it says, now Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Do you guys remember we talked about Ahithophel last week? He was at one point a very trusted and wise counselor of David. There are passages and verses, I think, that I don't remember if we read them this week or last week, that kind of talked about at one time Ahithophel gave wise counsel. It was almost as if the Lord himself had I was going to say spake it. We don't say that anymore, do we? Had spoken it, right? Or had spake it. And so he was a good counselor. And he is now counseling Absalom. And so Absalom and Ahithophel are there, and then we have our friend the mole, Hushai the Archite, is there, David's friend, and they're all three together. And Absalom says kind of questions at first Hushai's loyalty, and Hushai convinces Absalom to kind of listen to him, or at least let him remain, by saying, I'm with whoever the Lord is with. The Lord and his people and all the men of Israel have chosen his, and I will be with you, and I will remain with you. So it basically says, if this is what God's chosen, then I'm kind of here to be a part of of that. I'm on the side of the people, I'm on the side of the Lord, and that's how he kind of wiggles his way in, so to speak. And so now Absalom requests counsel from Ahithophel, and he gives him counsel, and it's kind of bizarre counsel, right? What's his counsel? What does he tell him he should do now that he's entered the city, entered David's palace, so on and so forth? What is his instruction?
David's concubines.
Yeah, he says, go into your father's concubines and take measure of them. It was an interesting detail that maybe upon initial examination a few weeks ago didn't really catch your eye, that David took everybody but left 10 concubines. And now we see kind of why the narrator chose to include that part of the story. And that's an interesting piece of advice. And it kind of I think it's there for several reasons. One, it is prominent to the story, but two, it kind of shows us that Ahithophel maybe has lost his way as counselor. And we can talk a little bit later about why that might have been and what's kind of guiding his advice giving or his heart right now. But anyway, he gives him this advice. And there's a few reasons why he might do this. Kind of think through a few of them. One, this would be a very public claim to the throne. And so there was no discretion used in this, right? They said, go up, you're going to put a tent on the roof. It's no accident that this occurs on the roof, because when it draws our mind back to when David was on the roof, right? And that's how his sin kind of started against Bathsheba and Uriah. And so we see that there's a drawback to there. Now Absalom's going to do this on the roof. They're going to have a tent up there. He's going to go into the concubines and publicly, which was part of the prophecy, right? Or the curse that David receives a few chapters back because of his sin, right? That they would go in and take his wives from him. It would be done in the sight of all of Israel. And so there's a public claim to the throne by taking what was rightfully the king's, and really at the most intimate of levels, Absalom is saying, I am the king now. Secondly, it draws a line in the sand. Like, there's no going back after this. The rebellion, if at any point he could have said, changed my mind, I'm going to retreat, it's over now. There's no going back after such a vile offense. And then three, and this is kind of an unusual one, he says that after you do this, Ahithophel says, you go into the concubines who he's left in the house, all of Israel will hear that you've made yourself a stench to your father. And he said, all the hands of Israel who are with you will be strengthened. That this is somehow going to rally support. That they'll see that you are a stench to your father. You are fully against David. We know that we have drawn the line here. And it said that their hands will be strengthened. And Israel will now see that you have the upper hand here. You are the superior king. And now we will fully and firmly serve you. And then fourthly, and this is maybe not as much as of Absalom's, I think, intent here, but also I think this is, there's a little bit of Ahithophel driving the car here now, where I think this was meant to dishonor David. Now, what event did we say may have drawn Ahithophel away from David into the favor of Absalom? Anyone remember? Yeah. So he's Bathsheba's grandfather, and so he would probably jump at this opportunity to try and right that wrong, right? To dishonor David in the way that his family, his daughter, his son-in-law were offended. And so there's a lot going on here in this council. But nevertheless, it's not even the first time we see. There's a parallel passage in the Old Testament where one of the sons of Jacob actually goes into his father's concubines. And it wasn't a play to only fulfill a lust, but it was a power play to show that Reuben, his name was Reuben, and as the oldest son, he was making a challenge for being the patriarch or the authoritative figure in the family. And he went in Genesis 35 and laid with his father's concubine. And so it's interesting parallel, because he goes in and he lays with Jacob's concubine, and what he actually did this privately, whereas Absalom does it publicly. But they both are rebelling in this way to challenge their father's authority. And in Reuben's case, it cost Reuben his birthright and his future. He's kind of cut off, so to speak. And so there's echoes of that passage here. We talked a little bit, I think, in your homework about how Leviticus 18, as if it needed to be said, is like, hey, just so you guys know, in Israel, we won't lay with our father's wives. And yet he's in violation of that law here. And so that's what's kind of happening here. This is all being fulfilled in our before our eyes here in chapter 16. And it's interesting to see these consequences played out. One of the things we talk about when we look at the curses and the consequences of sin. I know kind of growing up as a kid in the church, there was always this connection, I think, as you're just young and you're learning the Bible to kind of think, if I do wrong, God is going to strike me, or if I sin, God is going to punish me. And what really happens to David, as he was, and Absalom as well, as they're receiving, or the reception of the consequences of their sin, really doesn't come from God putting his hand on them. It comes from God taking his hand off. And all God had to do to really have this rebellion unfold, to have David be at the on the run and and to be the man fleeing, was really to kind of take his hand of favor off. And that's how we often fear God, and we think you fear him in a way where he's going to put his hand on you. But really, the way we properly fear and revere the Lord is to be aware of what might happen should he take his hand off. Before we get into 17, while this isn't, again, the main point of 16, I would want to point out, practically speaking, chapter 16 is like an essay in all the wrong ways to make decisions. And I don't just mean like they're bad or unwise. But we see it kind of starts off with Ziba, and it's like, we're not even listening to every side of the story. We're not listening to both sides of the story. We're not considering what the full story might be. We're making a decision by listening to one party, one story, one person. Two, we see Abishai say that the easiest way to make a decision is to just deal with it fiercely and quickly and get over it, instead of the way David says, hey, could God be in this? Abishai gives us this example of what the danger of making rash decisions, or a warning against making rash decisions. And then 3, there's a situation where we have someone seeking counsel. They want wise counsel, but don't consider whether that is godly counsel. And there's a difference between seeking wise counsel and wise godly counsel. And so the counsel that Absalom received was wise from a strategic standpoint, to assert power, to have authority, but it was unwise, and that was a clear violation of God's law and God's way. And so, any questions on chapter 16 before we get into 17? Everything kind of connects, but I want to make sure we pause. So in 17, the story continues, right? Now we're going to have kind of a showdown of advisors, right? That Absalom's got a plan. What's Absalom's ultimate goal and what he's about to do, what he's trying to do?
Kill David.
Yeah, I want to kill David for the purpose of what?
Take over his army and or to be like the only king.
Yeah, I'm going to be the king. I'm going to overthrow David and his army, and I'm going to take over rule. Somebody speak out loud how to spell Ahithophel so I don't mess it up.
Ahitho.
Okay.
Phel.
I like how you did that so fast. I think I got it. We'll see. And then Hushai is the second. So let's compare their advice. I don't usually do a lot of whiteboard, but this might help you see it as we move forward. So Absalom takes advice on how he should militarily attack David. And there's 4 or 5 pieces to each of theirs in their decisions. So in the first 4 verses, what is Ahithophel's advice to what Absalom should do?
Tells him to choose 12,000 men to like,
Okay.
invade.
So that's the first point. So we're gonna take a small group of men. Why would you only take a small portion of the army? What's he doing here? He's minimizing what?
Attention.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a night attack.
It's low attention and it's low risk. We're not risking, if something goes wrong, maybe we lose 1,000 or 2,000 guys, which I know that's a ton, but we're minimizing risk. Okay, he says, so we'll take a small group of select men, and then what's he gonna do? What's the plan?
He believes that they're weary and discouraged, and his troops will ultimately run away, and they'll kill David.
Yeah, they'll run away. They're gonna pursue them, and they think they'll run away because it's a surprise. His plan is a surprise attack. Pursue, surprise, and then we'll put the.
He also says, "I will kill the king," but
Right.
not talking about Ahithophel,
Mhm.
or I mean, not talking about Absalom. Correct? Is he referring to himself?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume that's who I will strike down the only king, and I will bring, and that's important to note because, well, yeah, that's a very good point. Because, well, we'll get there. in a second.
Because of Hushai,
Because of how Hushai wins his heart. So we're gonna pursue him by surprise. Somebody, I think you already said this. They'll flee. The plan is to make them panic. And then who are they? What's the aim? To kill as many men as possible? To kill who? We'll kill just David. Kill David. And then after that, he says, I will kill David, and then I will what? Return.
Bring everyone.
I'll
back.
return all the people to you. So we're not talking about wiping out the whole army, everybody that's with David, but return all the people. Okay. What is Hushai's plan for Absalom? So first he lays the groundwork by the plan by pointing out that they're angry, that they're mad, that they're very skilled, and that David is expert in war. So Hushai, let me see, verse 11, he talks about, we'll gather all of Israel gathered to you from Dan to. My counsel is that all of Israel will be gathered to you from Dan to Bathsheba as a sand by the sea of the multitude, that you will go to battle in person. So his first plan, or parts of his plan, that'll take time to do. So his first thing is to delay. Let's wait. His second piece is he's going to gather all of Israel, and then who's going to actually go and fight?
Absalom.
Yeah, he says, you will go. He says, Absalom will go and fight in person. And then we'll come upon him in some place, verse 12, where he's to be found, and we shall light upon him as the dew falls to the ground, and of him and all the men there will not be one left. Basically, even if they go into the city, we'll drag it down to the dirt. And for what purpose does he say we'll do this? Or, let's not say what purpose is said here, but why would he suggest this? Why would he suggest such a full-blown military attack where we wipe out every enemy, or everyone on David's side, not just David.
Is it because he's just assuming that all of the men are on David's side? Like, you're not gonna be able to, unlike Ahithophel's advice, right, which was like, hey, let's just kill David, and then everybody's gonna come and serve you, Absalom, right? Shai is kind of like, no, we gotta kill everybody, because, well, I don't know if
Yeah, but
that's a
he's
question. What?
He's really loyal to David.
Well, I know, but he might be setting them up, I don't, but.
Yeah, so the whole thing is a ploy to what? Why is he appealing to?
Listening to it sometimes.
He being Hushai is appealing.
What is Hushai appealing to in Absalom?
I feel like his kind of like desire to be king and kind of just like boosting his ego. in a
Yeah,
sense.
he just pulls on his pride
Yeah.
over the whole time. He said, we will wait, that's moral activity right there, right? Give David more time, give him a warning, we'll see later. Then we're gonna bring all of Israel together. It's part of the delay, but also we're gonna make this a spectacle. And then he said, you will get the glory here because you'll be the one that's fighting, and you will fight, and you'll be the one who kills, David or all the men. And then we'll show what happens to anyone who opposes you. We'll show your authority. And so you see that there's two plans here. Speaking only from military strategy standpoint, who has the more wise advice here?
Ahithophel.
Everybody agree with that?
I don't know, I mean, wipe everybody out.
Yeah. This is why in this situation, this is the more wise counsel. Because we're gonna see what happens by taking a large army into the terrain where David is, or will be, I should say. You've got the element of surprise, which I feel like, is always a good thing. You create a panic so that people flee and they're scattered and you're not fighting as many folks. Only David alone dies, and then all the people are returned, which is a good thing. There's no unnecessary death, there's no unnecessary loss of life, and people who have been shown that type of mercy tend to follow whoever's in charge. But this appeals to Absalom's pride. He gets so much more glory out of this. And there's one big piece that's missing from Ahithophel's plan, and that's that God is not in it. Because in verse 14 it says, and Absalom and all the men said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel, for the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. So ultimately, it doesn't matter who gives the wise counsel here. God is pulling the strings, and God is ultimately in control. But we've already seen this a couple times too. That I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but one of the things that's just wild in some of these narratives is the amount of manipulation that occurs. That we have to ask ourselves, how do we guard our hearts against being manipulated by our emotions? And I don't know that 16 through 20 of 2 Samuel gives us kind of how to really do that very well. But at the same time, it's a question worth asking. There are going to be, whether it's false teaching, whether it's temptation, whether it's, there are always going to be things pulling at our pride. And some of those things sound good and sound glorious, and maybe that sometimes appear godly. But that's how the enemy, I think, gets us to kind of make unwise decisions. And I think it's been that way since the garden, is pull on their pride and the desires of our flesh. And so there's a caution here to not be too easily manipulated. Like, Absalom was wise to get counsel, but it's not wise godly counsel. We need folks to give us wise godly counsel so that we aren't easily manipulated. Verse 14, again, there is that ominous narrator's note. The Lord had anointed the counsel to defeat Absalom. No matter, Ahithophel's wonderful advice or strategically wonderful advice really doesn't matter in the end, because God had already ordained Hushai's advice. So then we have in verses 15, pick up the pace just a smidge. Hushai sends Zadok and Abiathar to David, or he has them, I should say, send messengers to warn. So we've got 2 messengers and a female servant, so that David can get into a more advantageous terrain, which comes into play greatly down the road here. We'll see, but there's an interesting piece, right, where these 2 servants almost get caught. How do they escape getting caught?
The one who puts them in the wall.
What's that?
The one who puts them in the wall.
Yeah, which is another callback to when Israel first sent 2 spies to spy out the land, and Rahab, the woman, there in Jericho hides them, and they are able to escape. We have that here too. They're able to escape and give David warning. And so we get through that story. The woman tells, hey, they've actually gone over to the brook of water, here in verse 20. And they're like, well, they looked for him, they couldn't find him, so they went back to Jerusalem. We don't even know the servants. We don't know these two messengers' names. We don't know this woman who hid them. We don't even know her name. But yet, there is an example of quiet faithfulness, I think, here that is really an endeavor worth giving our life to. Again, just a small nugget to pick up on there as we go through the passage, but she doesn't lead the battle. She doesn't carry a sword. She doesn't win a victory or wear a crown, but yet at the same time, there's a quiet faithfulness that really is the fulcrum of what this whole story is going to depend on here in a few seconds. And so we get into kind of towards the end of the chapter. David arose, they crossed the Jordan. We always want to note anytime somebody crosses the Jordan. They crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, not one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. And then we get this kind of interruption here between verses 22 and 24 that Ahithophel did not take the news that his counsel was not received very well. And responds by saddling his donkey and going home to his own city, put his house in order, as a wise person would, but then he actually hangs himself and he dies and was buried in the tomb of his father. We're not told why Ahithophel does this. So we're left to kind of speculate or kind of wonder. Did he feel defeated because he lost his seat of influence? Like he's built his life, his reputation upon the fact that he's a wise counselor. Did he feel like he lost that power or that position? It's possible. I mean, it's hard for those, and I don't think Ahithophel's a young man here, but I think it's hard for those of us who are getting older to lose that seat of prominence or power or position that we once had. Is that part of it? Or has he realized in this moment that he knows, probably maybe in his wisdom, that this is a terrible plan, and I've betrayed David, and this is going to come back on me, or I'm wrestling with the guilt now, the fact that I have lifted my hand, so to speak, against God's anointed and can't handle that. I'm not sure which it is. It doesn't tell us which it is, at least here in this passage, and so nevertheless, it's thrown in there.
It's not is there any hint that it's a foreshadowing of
Judas?
Like, I hang myself after I betray.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to me because that's certainly a parallel where, Ahithophel and Judas both have this where they betray David, son of David, so on and so to speak. But I know when I first read this or started studying 2 Samuel, I feel like I felt I looked up and started thinking through parallels between Absalom and Judas, but Ahithophel and Judas, I think also, it's also there, yeah. So then we need to quickly, there are some folks here who bring David supplies. Again, the example of quiet faithfulness and their loyalty to David. So as they head into battle, if you had not had that kind of that verse 14 where it had kind of told us God was on the side of Hushai's advice and planned to defeat Absalom with it, you'd be kind of weighing the odds here, okay? So if this was going to be a battle and we didn't already know that God had foreordained the council of Hushai to reign supreme over Absalom, and that God was going to use this to bring harm to Absalom, we kind of be thinking through, okay, in this moment as they're about to battle, who has the upper hand between David and Absalom? Absalom's advantages, it seems like he has probably the number, at least he has people. He has a number of people on his side and their hearts are with him. He has charisma that has brought them that favor. He's got experienced and trusted advisors and mentors. And at least up to this point, he's got all the momentum, right? Like he has rallied the troops, he has sieged the city, he has taken the throne and David's wives, and has David's most trusted advisors, but seemingly Ahithophel and Hushai, both on his own side. And then David's advantages, for one, he's got some foreknowledge, or at least a warning. He knows what's coming. Hushai has warned him and sent those messengers. He's got leadership. He's got multiple commanders he can put inside of his army. He's got experience. They're a unified army. And then ultimately, you don't want to just throw the God card, but it's there, right? Like David has the favor of God with him. So, reverse Uno, whatever you want to call it. Like, David's kind of got that. But David does retreat, and what's significant about where David takes his army from a terrain standpoint? For the sake of, he takes them to a time. He takes them to a forest, right? He takes them to the wooded area. How's that going to work out for large armies? Not great. It neutralizes the size of the army, and it favors a group of smaller and skilled warriors. And then we get to chapter 18. It's kind of the culmination of Absalom's rebellion, right? That David divides his army, right, into thirds, puts one under Joab, one under Abishai, and one under Ittai the Gittite, who we met a few weeks ago, where David was just like, you don't have to go with me, you just got here. And he's like, of course I'm going to go. Well, he's leading an army. And we see kind of the duality of David in this, right? Because David is sending them to battle, and he wants them to obviously be successful, to fight well, to win. But what's he also telling them to do? Be kind to Absalom. And therein lies the duality of David, right? David, the king, knows Absalom must be stopped. But David, the dad, cannot stop loving his son. And we see a lot of conflict in David, to the point where I think wisely, they have him hang back during this battle. And so he says, again, an example of David's humility, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So he stood at the gate. But he did give him this, right? He gives Joab and Abishai and Ittai these instructions to deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard that when he gave those orders. They make sure the narrator knows that everyone heard the orders to deal gently with Absalom. Everybody listens the same way, so comprehension. So when we go out here, one thing to point out now is that one of the ways I think we know Absalom has got quite the following is that now whenever we're talking about Israel in these passages, in this battle, it's talking about Absalom's men. That so many of the men, David's got kind of his loyal crew. A lot of those we talked about a few weeks ago were mercenaries from other countries that David had showed kindness to. But now there are here Absalom's men are referred to by the name of Israel, and it says in verse 7 that there was a great loss that day. How many thousand died? Yeah. And there's an interesting tidbit here, right, in verse 8, that the battle spread all over the face of the country, and the forest devoured more people in that day than the sword. Again, we're not given a ton of detail here in this passage, but inquiring minds probably wonder, what does it mean that the forest would devour more people than the sword?
It's kind of like, in war where like dysentery takes out more
Yeah.
people than, battle, you know, could have been. Wow, Lord, you know, who knows?
Yeah.
Branches apparently were quite.
Yeah. Yeah.
serious.
Yeah, I think it causes chaos, it causes confusion, and we've seen stories in books looking before 1 Samuel and even maybe some after 2 Samuel where God kind of fights for his people by creating confusion and chaos and these types of things and these types of terrain. And so, yeah, I think that's part of it. You know, and I don't know what that means. I don't know if there's trees falling over. I don't know if people are falling off cliffs. I don't know exactly what it all means, but nevertheless, Forrest is fighting for the Lord in this situation, and so I want to. That's one of those things where it's like I want to camp out here longer and learn more about this, but for time's sake, you know, we all have to move on. It's not probably a main emphasis in the story, but I find it fascinating. And then we see that kind of come to fruition. We'd already talked a little bit last week about Absalom being noted for his beautiful appearance, and most specifically his beautiful what? Yeah, he would have like an annual, probably a party where he cut his hair and they lopped off 5 pounds of hair every year. He had this beautiful mane, and ultimately he's betrayed by it, right? We get this note in verse 8 about the forest devouring more people than the sword. And now we have this happen to Absalom, right? That he gets his hair caught in the great oak. And so he's suspended there, right? His mule keeps on going, and he is caught in the limbs of this tree by his hair. And it just says a certain man saw him and went and told Absalom. And what's Absalom's response to this man who said, this certain man says, I saw Absalom hanging in the tree by his hair. And what's Joab's response? You should have killed him. Right? And they have two different responses to Absalom being kind of stuck there, right? The certain man trembled at the thought of ever harming Absalom. He's heard David's instructions. He's not going to defy the king. And so he trembles at the thought. And Joab, what's his response?
I would have rewarded you.
Yeah. 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 Joab doesn't get a second thought. Joab's kind of like, I don't have time for you. I can't waste my time with you. And he runs off. And they ultimately, Joab, I think, starts kind of the slaying of Absalom, right? Three spears to the heart. And then it seems like maybe they get Absalom down and the rest of the army joins in. And so we're again conflicted, right? My wife texted me this week and she's going through the study in her class, and she's like, I don't know how to feel about Joab. Like, how are we supposed to feel about Joab? I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy, right? And we're kind of wrestling here too. Like, should Joab receive justice or mercy for ignoring David's instructions to be gentle with Absalom? And it's not the first time we've been conflicted about this guy in the same way. So, somewhere down the road, we'll get into our First Kings study and learn about what comes with Joab. So, but nevertheless, we're kind of left with that tension. The narrator doesn't ease it for us at this time. But then they throw Absalom's body into a pit. And it says, now in Absalom, in his lifetime, he had taken and set up for himself a pillar that is in the king's valley. For he says, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it's called Absalom's monument to this day. And so Absalom kind of gets his personal, permanent monument, which is kind of fitting. That was kind of his life's endeavor, and achieved it in his death, I suspect. Maybe it kind of like one of those situations like where Christ said, well, they have their reward, and like, well, you know, Absalom, this is kind of what you wanted, but nevertheless, we kind of have to, for time's sake, we'll keep going, but there's lots to unpack with this, probably with that Absalom's permanent memorial that I'd like to spend more time on, but maybe we'll have time for that next week. But in verse 18 through the close of the chapter, kind of deals with, okay, how are we going to tell David that Absalom's dead? Who's going to do it? And what's David's response going to be? So Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, really wants to go and tell David the news, but Joab doesn't want him to do that. Why do you think Joab might refuse to let Ahimaaz go and tell David about Absalom's death?
Someone to be killed.
Yeah, probably fearful of David's reaction, right? There's a lot of people, it seems like, who run up to David and say, I've got some really good news about a dead guy. And David is not really taking it well. We've already seen a couple people pass away from this tragic mistake, but this guy's insistent on running, and he comes out and he tells the king all is well. Blessed be the Lord your God who has delivered the men the men who raised their hand against the Lord my king. And Ahimaaz says, David says, is it well with the young man Absalom? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I don't know what it was. That's not a truthful answer, right? He knows Absalom's dead. And so the king says, I see somebody else running. Let me see what else. You wait here. And so the Cushite comes and says, good news for the Lord, my king. The Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you. And he asks, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. And the Cushite's response is basically, may anyone who raises up as an enemy of you, David, meet the same fate as Absalom. And David knows immediately that Absalom has died. And what's David's response to Absalom's death?
He mourns.
Yeah. See, David wept. He was deeply moved. He says, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. David is deeply, deeply grieved to the point where he wishes it had been him instead. And we get, again, there's a duality to David we talked about earlier, and this is the father side of him, right? David kind of recognizes, I think, in this moment that Absalom is kind of part of that curse that, he's essentially dying for David's sin. It doesn't mean that Absalom wasn't responsible for his own actions. He absolutely was. But this whole thing kind of started with David's sin, and a son of David died for David's sin. And if David had put to death the sins of his flesh, he would not have seen his flesh die. And so there's a lot of purpose and instruction in meeting in that. Like, we have to examine ourselves so deeply. Like, is there a sin that we are trying to keep in all of our goodness and all the godly things that we do? Is there a sin that we're trying to keep? Because the one thing we're going to see, we've already seen, or we're going to continue seeing, is that sin will have a huge ripple effect. There's another part of this too, as we see God has remained faithful to David. He's disciplined David. And when we pray for God to be faithful, we often think that means he'll bless us. But one thing we want to remember about God is his act of disciplining us is just as much an act of his faithfulness as his blessing us. And so when we pray for God to be faithful to us, we're not only looking to receive his blessing, but also his discipline should we be out of step with his character and conduct and what he would have us to do. But David's grief is deep. It is hard. He's hurting. And that grief and that hurt that he has as father is not received well by everyone from the position of king, right? So they see David grieving. Some folks see David grieving and they don't like it. Who doesn't like it? Yeah. Why is Joab so upset to see David grieving over the death of Absalom?
Your opponent just won you a victory, and you're turning it into all being all about, Absalom.
There are men who put their life and their families on the line, probably some men who lost their life, fighting for you to overcome an enemy for you, for your kingdom, for your kingship. He said, how could you, he doesn't say necessarily spit in their face, but how could you shame them, shame those who fought for you and brought you victory by weeping over the enemy? How could you hate those who love you? The army is hurting or maybe in your eyes feel as if they're nothing because of your response. And he encourages him. Joab says, David, you have to go out and you have to speak to them. You have to encourage them. And he almost makes a kind of a veiled threat here. He says, if you don't, he said, I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. It isn't unwise or crazy to think that this will play a part. David's response may play a part in the disunity that we see in the chapters ahead too, as the army wrestles with David's kingship, or the people, I should say, wrestle with that. And so, 20,000 Israelites lost their life in these endeavors, and David is mourning just one, and Joab has a problem with that. 20,000 men of Israel died in this, and you're weeping over just this one. Joab has no problem with with justice here. And he's like, the law says, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. That happens, someone's hanging on a tree. And so he's cursed, and we're not going to weep over that. But David, again, as king, he knows that's right, but as dad, he's struggling, right? So, at the beckoning, kind of pushing, nudging of Joab, now the battle's over, David returns to Jerusalem. In Israel, at this point, every man had fled into his own home, and all the people were arguing throughout all the tribes of Israel, right? So they're saying, this king has delivered us from the hands of enemies. He saved us from the Philistines, but now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. What are we going to do? Do we bring the king back? Are we supposed to welcome him back? We've rebelled. What are we supposed to do here? They're looking for guidance, for leadership. How do we now bring David back, whom we rebelled against? So David sends messengers again through the priests. He wants to bring all the tribes back. He said, why would you? But he deals specifically with Judah. It seems like maybe the other tribes are coming around slowly, but Judah is holding out, right? Any guesses as to why Judah is holding out, even though that's where David's from? Any reason to think they maybe they don't feel safe? Where'd the rebellion start? Absalom's rebellion started in Judah. And so maybe they're skeptical. Maybe Absalom still has a little bit of a hold there. Maybe they're worried that David will deal unharshly with them. But he tells them, you are my brothers, my bone and flesh. Why would you be the last to bring back the king? And then he tries to make a kind of a peace offering with Judah and says to Amasa, you're my bone and my flesh. God, do so to me and more also, if you're not the commander of my army now in place of Joab. And in this action of setting up Amasa and speaking these words to Judah, it says he swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man. One thing you learn about Israel, their hearts are swayed pretty easily a lot of times, which is, again, part of that manipulation thing we gotta guard against a little bit there. But remember, even as David sat on the throne and was actively ruling Israel, Absalom was able to go out to the gates and kiss the babies and shake hands and give advice and win the heart of the people over to rebel against David. And now David, in this act alone, has once again stolen the hearts of Israel and won them back. Or in this place, I guess in this situation, Judah. So in our mind, we're like, okay, this is it, right? David has successfully swayed the heart of all people as one man in Israel, and now they'll be permanently his forever. Before we get too far ahead, though, there's probably not an easier way to condense the rest of chapter 19 the way it's done in your workbook on page 103. We see David pardoning his enemies, right? So the people we met earlier, we get to kind of check in on again. I guess it's probably not fair to call everyone here an enemy, but he encounters three of the subjects to his kingdom. We met Shimei earlier. What was Shimei doing earlier?
Cursing.
Yeah, and now in verse 19, he's like, Lord, not my Lord, man of blood earlier. Now let not my Lord hold me guilty. Remember how your servant did wrong. And he asked him, don't take to heart any of my past actions. And David kind of does he forgive him, yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah, he says, you're not going to die. I'm not going to take your life for the way you cursed me earlier. And then we have our friend Mephibosheth shows up. And what does Mephibosheth reveal about Ziba's actions at the beginning of our lesson, chapter 16?
He deceived him and took the donkeys without giving them a chance to get on.
Yeah, Ziba kind of took matters in his own hand. It wasn't a situation where Mephibosheth saw Absalom coming and saw that as advantageous as Ziba saw Absalom coming and thought this would be advantageous. And so it's an interesting thing, though. Again, we're talking about wisdom and decisions. I kind of expected, as you read this passage, naturally we'll see, say, well, now Ziba's going to face consequences and Mephibosheth will be restored. And is that what happens? Exactly. Like, well, he's like, I don't know who's telling the truth because I didn't investigate earlier. I don't know who's telling the truth, what's right or what's wrong necessarily. So let's just divide it in half. And what's Mephibosheth's response to that?
Says he can keep all of it.
I don't care about that. Yeah, give him all of it. The king is back and that's all that matters.
He neglected his own hygiene as long as David was away,
Yeah.
so it's like, that kind of like proof. But he was loyal to David.
Does that, for those of you who maybe read ahead, does that idea of David's not sure who's right or wrong, so we're just going to cut it in half, does that ring a bell for?
Solomon?
Yeah, Solomon does the same thing too, except it's not land. What is it? Yeah, Solomon, one of the famous stories of Solomon's wisdom, right? It says, we don't know whose child this is. We'll just cut it in half. You'll each get half. And you're like, no, we won't do that. We won't do the one who's like, yeah, that's fine. You're like, you're not the real mom. And so, yeah, so there's that situation. And lastly, we have, I can't say this, but Barzillai, who was kind of faithful to David. He furnished the army. And David wants to bring him into the kingdom, restore him, give him a seat. And he's kind of like, no. He's kind of like, I'm old, I'm done. I'm not going to be a hindrance to you. I just want to go back home. He passes his blessing on to his servant who goes and blesses him and allows him to go back to his city. And so we see David kind of bestow mercy here where he can and as he's restored to kingship. And then we get to 40. And what are we doing here? We talked earlier about how it's hard to keep these people's heart in line. And it says in verse 40 that the king went to Gilgal and Chimham went on with him, and all the people of Judah and also the half the people of Israel brought the king on his way. And we get to 41. Then all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household over the Jordan, and all David's men with him? All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is our close relative. Why then are you angry? Haven't we all eaten at the king's expense? Hasn't he given us a gift? And the men of Israel answered to the men of Judah, we have 10 shares in the king, and in David also we have more than you. Why do you despise us? We're not the first to speak of bringing back our king, but the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. What's happening between Israel and Judah? Right? So they're in conflict. It was a big deal for us when we were studying this passage, when we were studying 2 Samuel, and David finally took kingship over all of Israel. We had a unified kingdom. They really struggled to maintain that. And even on the tail ends of victories like David had just won here, they're still struggling. That Judah, or the southern kingdom, and then the other tribes, northern kingdom, struggle with conflict and unity. And it really gives us, they're struggling, they're arguing over who's more loyal and who has more honor. And lots of times we think that just because we have an absence of external threats or an absence of conflict or an absence of issues, that automatically equals unity, but that's not true. That division and discord and unity exist wherever there's rivalry and resentment in the heart. And so even though they're rescued from their enemies, there's not wars or battles being placed, there's still resentment there, there's still a rivalry, and that shows us just how fragile unity is. And when unity isn't deeply rooted, it will be disrupted. And that's what happens as we get into chapter 20. We have, in chapter 20, there happened to be a worthless man. We noted that from verse 7 of chapter 16 earlier, right? That was the curse that Shemaiah was speaking at David. You're a worthless man. It means worthless, of no value, wicked, lawlessness. Sometimes if you've got an older version or a different translation, instead of worthless, it'll say sons of Belial. King James always grew up with it. That's the version I grew up with. It said sons of Belial. In the New Testament, you'll see that translation as well, and it refers to a demon or a spirit of lawlessness. And so we see that being accurate. There's a lawless man now who's going to try and, again, sway the hearts of Israel to rebel against David. And verse 2 shows us it was successful. And I thought, I was kind of looking this up and kind of, you look in, you do the math and kind of see like, surely there had to be a gap in between 19 and 20, and there's really not. That they were swayed pretty quickly after what had just occurred to again rebel against David. And so this person drew Israel from David, and many of them follow Sheba, the son of Bichri, but the men of Judah follow their king. So there's a divided kingdom here, which will be the story of a lot of the rest of the Old Testament from this point forward. So David goes back to Jerusalem. There's a brief kind of pause here to let us know what happens to those concubines. David cares for them, but he can't go back into them or restore them because of what happened to them. And so he cares for them, but they kind of live as shut-ins, kind of as we saw earlier with Tamar. But then we get back, and David's got this new king over his army, and he says, you need to go to Judah and tell them to rally the troops and get here within 3 days. Does Amasa follow those instructions? What mistake does he make? He delayed, right? Whether he was afraid, whether he was inexperienced, whether he didn't feel like he could command the army, whatever it was, he delayed the direct orders of the king. And so David, kind of seemingly after Amasa is already on his way, sends Abishai to kind of with the same message. And so en route, who do they encounter? Who does Amasa encounter? Joab. And so Joab seemingly has been demoted and is not taking it well, and is kind of seemingly waiting for Amasa to make a mistake, which he's done here. And that mistake seems like it's given Joab enough room or for him to justify the taking of life. It says that Joab actually comes, he takes Amasa by the beard with his right hand and kisses him, but what he doesn't see is that there's a sword in Joab's other hand. He struck him with the stomach. We get the wonderful detail that he did so much that spilled his entrails on the ground, and he died without even receiving a second blow. And so Joab and his brother, they pursue Sheba. After this, so Amasa, and what's the irony here between Joab and Amasa? Are they sworn enemies by birth? No, they're cousins. So he killed his cousin to restore his own position, his own right to where he should be. And they get to they get to Abel of Beth Makkah, and all of Sheba's, they're kind of in this fortified city, so to speak, and David's army's in pursuit, and their intent is to destroy the city and wipe it out. But who intervenes? There's just a wise woman who speaks, and what's her counsel to the hot-headed Joab? It sounds a lot like Ahithophel's wisdom here a little bit too, but basically, why should this city, who's been like a mother in Israel, why should it be destroyed, and why should we all perish when really the issue's only with one person? And really gives us a wonderful example of wisdom to follow here, that wisdom seeks precision. What is the real issue? And ultimately, wisdom seeks peace. Let's avoid costly casualties. And so we've seen this a few times. We saw this in the story of, that might have been 1 Samuel, I guess, Abigail and Nabal, where David and Nabal are going to come to blows foolishly, and she intervened with wisdom to stop the bloodshed, to stop the violence that would be costly and unnecessary. And that's what happens here. What happens to Sheba? Yeah. They saved the city and spared the city by cutting off his head, throwing it over the city walls, and that satisfies Joab and the army. And so, to kind of wrap up tonight, I don't feel rushed because it doesn't feel like anybody's ready to go outside, right? It's pouring rain. Is that, that's what that is. Okay. As we kind of wrap tonight, kind of recap what we kind of walked through here, and it's a lot. 16 through 20. Appreciate your patience, but chapter 16 brought us a humiliated king, right? David's been run out of his city by his son, who takes his palace and then takes his wives. Chapter 17, we see an embarrassed kingdom that is thankfully preserved by the providence and power of God. Chapter 18, there's the judgment of a rebellious son. He's judged, but he's still deeply loved. In chapter 19, we see messy and kind of a mold and partial restoration of Israel. And then we close in 20 where the kingdom is fractured yet again. And so we get these glimpses of hope amongst all the chaos and glimmers of glory and all the sin. And what we've seen here isn't just, well, this is just sinners being sinners. It's not just, we're not just looking at chaos, but we are looking at the consequences of sin, right? And what's the narrator, I think, wants us to know is that even as great of a king as David is, he's unable to fully restore. He can't restore the kingdom, and he can't restore the hearts of the people. And we've kind of stopped as we've gone through this. We've hit on some nuggets of truth and things to watch out for and correction. But I don't want us to graze over the fact that the main and the deepest issue here isn't poor leadership, isn't just bad decisions or family dysfunction. The issue is the heart. The issue is it's a heart issue. It's a human heart. Every chapter has been showing us or tried to show us that the issue isn't external, that it lies within. Whether that's Absalom's pride or Joab's vengeance or David's fear and passivity. Even Israel's division and discord. It's all a heart issue. That the kingdom is unstable because their hearts are unstable. And David is limited in his ability to fully restore, especially at the heart level. That David absorbs suffering in chapter 16, but he does it imperfectly. He's preserved by God, but kind of passively in chapter 17. In 18, he longs to save his son, but he can't do it. In 19, he restores the kingdom, but only partially. And in chapter 20, he can't stop a rebellious people. But David is a really good king, and he'll go down kind of as one of, if not, I guess, you probably the prototypical king, maybe the best king that Israel had. But he's not a sufficient king. And I think that's interesting to point out in the way that it worked out this week, because last week we celebrated Palm Sunday, which commemorates Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where he received shouts of Hosanna. And he was praised as a king in hopes that he was going to be this political force that was going to overthrow Roman tyranny. And they were right in that Jesus is king. Like, he was worthy of all that praise, but they missed out on his kingdom and what that was going to look like. His way of restoring things to right again was, even as a king, looked much different than they expected. And one of the things we want to cling to, especially as we begin to look at next week, where we'll kind of wrap up this book, is ultimately where David falls short, Christ fulfills. David is humiliated for his own sin, really against his will, but Jesus is willingly humiliated and remains sinless. That David is preserved from death, Jesus goes into death and conquers it. That David wants to die for his son, Jesus actually dies for the rebel. David restores a fractured kingdom, but again, it remains fractured. Jesus creates a unified people by changing their hearts. David cannot stop future rebellion, but Jesus is able to defeat sin at its root. David cannot take Absalom's place, but Jesus is able to take ours. But we'll look at and celebrate tomorrow night, right? In our Good Friday service. And David could not heal the kingdom, but Jesus is building one that cannot be shaken. David could not change hearts, but Jesus is able to give new ones. So how do we respond to Jesus as King? We kind of talked about this a little bit already. One of the things I neglected, I think, to point out a few weeks ago, we kind of talked about this, was it should challenge us to examine our faith and how we view Jesus. in the sense that I think in our culture and in our context, faith has become more of an acknowledgement or affirmation than anything else. That we attest that something is true, but to recognize Jesus as King requires much more than an affirmation or a box to check, right? And it's more than lip service. It requires full surrender. That's how we respond to the right King. We give him our full allegiance, and I think that's a part of what it means to have faith that we often leave out in our current context, is that faith is also an allegiance. We pledge our lives to his will. And it's easy to get bogged down, especially when we see what happened to David's kingdom, and not feel like there's hope in it, in the kingdom that is coming or what Christ is building. But David's kingdom was marked by chaos and division, and it was left unfinished. But in Christ's kingdom, it's much, much different, right? There are no rival kings. There are no divided loyalties. There are no unresolved sin. There is no fragile peace. That one day the King who stepped into chaos for us will return, and what has been broken will be fully made whole. And that's why Jesus is the King that we need. 2 Samuel 16-20 shows us what happens when sin runs through the kingdom unchecked, and it's messy and it's painful and it's often left unresolved. It also shows us why we need a better king. And the good news for us, we'll look at on Sunday, is that we have one. A king who didn't just wish to save his rebels, but actually died to save them. So again, our challenge tonight is to allow him as king to rule our hearts. I'm going to close this in prayer, but I'm happy to stay and discuss as much as you'd like to or take questions. I have no desire to go outside right now. Let's pray. Father God, we come before you humbly, submitting and surrendering to your way, your word, and your will. And we just pray that it would take root in us in such a way that we surrender our lives to you, whatever you would have from us, whatever you would desire from us. God, that we would, you'd place a desire in our hearts to not be attached to this world, but to seek first your kingdom. We're thankful to serve a risen King who conquered all enemies, including the last and great enemy that is death. And we're looking forward to celebrating that, not just this weekend, but each and every day. We're thankful for it. We're thankful for the gift of your Son. And we just pray that we would live lives surrendered to him. We love you today and praise for your grace. In Jesus' name, amen. Any questions or comments? That's a lot. It was a lot to get through, but we did it. You guys should be proud of yourselves. Yeah. Next week is our last class. Usually last class I bring in pizza. I brought in pizza for the first class though this year. But yeah, we'll probably bring in some dinner next week because you guys save this class a ton of budget money on childcare because you don't bring any kids. So I think next week we'll probably plan on having some dinner here for you guys. We'll go out with we have 21 through 24, I think is in that section. So looking forward to it. See you guys next week.